Meeting is back in session. So under other matters, we have the Colgate Redevelopment Plan Review. Mr. Phillips, are you going to walk us through the highlights on this, or?
Sure. So, Mr. Chairman, subject to any changes, what I thought I would do was kind of go through this relatively quickly, and if there's something that I'm going to cover generally, you want to get into the specifics, kind of stop me there. I think that's probably the best way to do this. I think we can go through it fairly quickly, and then it all depends on comments and questions that the board has.
All right.
If you think that works.
Yeah, I just wouldn't spend any time at all on the things you've already mentioned before that are, the statutory basis.
Yep.
And the description of the boundaries,
Yep.
that kind of.
Yep. And this, by the way, is what a redevelopment plan looks like. A lot different than conventional zoning. As I indicated to you, it's 25 pages out. So as you mentioned, there's an introduction section which goes through the statutory basis and the description and the area history, which you're all familiar with. There's some mapping. Let's start on page 5. And I've outlined what I think would be the appropriate goals and objectives based upon some of the things that we've discussed at the prior meeting in terms of what we're looking for in terms of basically the transformation of this property from what it was to what the vision is. And I've outlined sort of everything that I could think of which kind of makes sense and that we covered in terms of goals and objectives. One point on relationship to local objectives in terms of the master plan. This gets into sort of a bit of a timing issue, but the intention is that if you recommend this document this evening for consideration by the Township Committee, the Township Committee would have a first reading of a ordinance similar to the first reading of a zoning ordinance. And then it would come back to you on referral, even though this document is emanating from you, it would come back to you on referral. And our intention, as I mentioned, is that we would have a master plan amendment for consideration the same evening as you would get this on referral. And provided we do it right and we deal with the master plan amendment first, and you adopt that master plan amendment, then you can make a consistency determination that this document would be consistent with the master plan. So that's why you see in this document will adopt sort of future language as opposed to you have adopted, because that hasn't been done. So we had to nuance that. Page 6 basically goes into, there's one thing of note that I want to spend on the plan terminology. You'll see there's references to shall and should. Shall is the equivalent to, the minimum lot size is 1 acre. You have to meet the 1 acre, you need a variance. Should basically provide some flexibility both for the redeveloper as well as the board. So there are things specifically with regard to architectural design standards and guidelines that we're looking to get quality building architecture design materials. And we use the word should because we don't want everything to end up being a variance situation, but this will give you the ability when the redeveloper comes in for site plan approval to know what kind of building design we were thinking of when we did the plan, and if anything is at variance with that, then there is some room for give and take between the developer and the board without it creating a variance situation. You have that guideline. The developer has that guideline, but not every single sentence where there might be a change would rise to the level of a variance. And it's typically done in redevelopment plans, and I use the shall and should language almost universally in the plans that I've drafted on behalf of my municipal clients. And then again, there's reference to some conceptual illustrations and photo examples. They're also in there, and they're in the appendix to show you, for example, let's just take the retail. There's some examples of retail to show you the kind of retail we're looking for in terms of some of the design elements, the materials, Things like the base being different from the major material, which is brick, some horizontal and vertical articulation in the massing. So when someone comes in with a building that's bland, you have in the plan not only the design guidelines, but this is kind of what we were looking for, sort of to hold the developer to some extent to the file. Still on page 6, these are all the permitted uses that we talked about when we met on this 2 weeks ago. Both for the residential open space component as well as the retail commercial component. Remember, the site's divided into 2 components. Page 7, the typical accessory uses for retail, commercial, and residential are included. Also, page 7, we talked about the retail commercial component requirement and residential open space. We provided some flexibility as to how much acreage, but it's within a fairly tight range. And we are, for example, requiring that the Hanover Avenue frontage be retail commercial with some flexibility on how much, and the balance as you move to the rear being the residential and open space component. Page 8 is the affordable. I think you have a question, I can tell.
I do. I'm showing this side, but I know probably a lot of board members have questions, and it just might be more efficient if we just kind of did it as you want.
Yeah, I think that's the best way to go.
So quickly, it's mentioned gatehouses. Is that actually in our current ordinances that we are permitted in the residential and open space?
We actually had that when we did the residential components of Honeywell. I mean, they don't have to do it, but we're just saying it's a permitted accessory use.
We did it for 100 because they're not doing
It's in the ordinance. I don't know whether it's part of, whether they proposed it in their plans. I don't think they did.
Are you sure they didn't take it out, or are you sure it's there?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's in there.
Because I don't remember about the Honeywell. I know there was at least one other townhome where the developer was interested in doing gatehouses. By gatehouses, I assume you mean a gated community.
An entry, it could be an entry, basically with a gate or a security guardhouse, whatever. It doesn't necessarily have the gate. It could be ornamental. But I swore we did this.
We have no ornament.
Yeah. I think, I swore we did this, and we're going to look it up. It's PUD.
The reason I ask is, board members, you might have other feelings, but to me, there are, to my knowledge, no real gated communities, and it's not anymore. It's not. And we didn't really want to encourage that, at least in some cases in the past. And personally, I'm not sure I want to encourage a gated community here. If the developer wants to come in and propose that, we can then discuss it and think about it at that time, but I feel more comfortable about it than then just allowing it right from the get-go here. If that's what
I personally don't have an issue if you take it out for those reasons. I don't think that the developer is going to have an issue with it. It's not shown on their current concept, so I'll go with whatever the board wants to do.
And the other thing, well, he's looking at, well, on this page 7. It doesn't really matter.
Yeah, it's there. It's there. It's there.
Yeah.
So in or out?
Personally, unless anyone wants to speak strongly for it at this point, my preference is not to give them permission to have a gated community.
I would agree with that.
I agree.
Um,
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. If we're going in order, I did have a quick question about page 6. I assume that a type of restaurant that could be on this proposed site would include a fast food restaurant, is that correct? There would be no restriction preventing a fast food restaurant from being on the site.
That's correct. The one limitation being that there would be no more than one drive-through, either restaurant or eating and drinking establishment. So
Understood.
it doesn't have to be. It could be Starbucks with a drive-through.
Understood. And my other question regarding restaurants, I assume a restaurant would be able to have a liquor license and operate in, with the liquor license as a part of the service they're providing.
There's nothing in this ordinance that would prevent that if the
If they're able to
potential
obtain their
business
own.
was able to acquire a liquor license.
Okay,
Yep.
thank you. Mr. Chairman, I do have some comments about page 7. If I-
Yeah.
Yeah,
Is now a good time?
yeah, go
Okay.
page by page.
The total, this total redevelopment area is 49.1 acres, 35% minimum for retail commercial, so that's about 17 acres. Max is 45%, which is 22 acres. And those are significant quantities of land, and they can come in a lot of different shapes and forms. I have concern about the second sentence in section C4A, that the retail commercial component shall encompass the entire Hanover Avenue frontage. In my opinion, the most important aspect of this redevelopment plan is the line that separates the retail commercial component and the residential open space component. If this plan is accepted, this board will only be able to review site plans where Hanover Avenue frontage is commercial, which will not allow us to evaluate plans where the entire property adjacent to Menon Arena does not have a commercial use. And I would like the opportunity to see site plans or concept plans that perhaps include the residential and open space portion being adjacent to Menon Arena in its entirety. So, for example, now the line that divides the retail, commercial, and residential is traveling east to west. If this language is accepted as is, this quote-unquote concept plan is that's going to be a fixed element in the concept plan, and will only be operating above and below that. Certainly there could be a consolidation of buildings, there could be movement of location of units, but this is the only concept plan I've seen, and I understand roadway exposure is extremely important to commercial uses, but I also value Menon Arena and the fact that that's county property, and the plan is to put a recreational field to the rear, to the south portion. I would like to see concepts that do not have commercial abutting the west side of the concept plan.
So that's a change in policy direction from where I thought we were at the last meeting. I think and I will say this, and not that this matters, but it's not the discussions that we've had to date with the redeveloper, which I've represented to this board. I think the issue was that it was intended that the entire Hanover Avenue frontage be reserved for retail commercial, and that there not be any portion of it devoted to residential for any number of reasons that we discussed. So, I mean, I think we should obviously entertain the comment, but that's
I'm certainly in agreement.
That's sort of my response as your consultant.
And perhaps one way to solve this would be to delete that sentence, so that we would have the opportunity to see concepts where the division is not east to west, that perhaps there would be a division north and south. Certainly, I'm all for the retail component and the residential open space component. I think that's appropriate for this site, but I'd like to see additional concepts where the lines are in a different location.
Again, that's a major policy change from kind of where we were, whether you want some portion of that frontage reserved for something other than retail commercial. And it gets to be just a trickier physical marketing plan to do that. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's not kind of where the discussions have gone so far. And it's your plan. It's your plan to recommend to the governing body. I'm just help you author it. That's kind of where we're
I think it's possible that there could be a concept where we could get 100,000, 130, 140,000 square feet of commercial by having more depth to the property on the Martin Luther King and Hanover Ave corner. If we were to look at the properties across the street that were developed by Hanover Township, for example, the ShopRite, there's significant depth to that property. It goes back many, many hundreds of feet. And I think there's a possibility that we could satisfy the community and the developer, but just so that this board has a chance to see plans where the line's in a different place.
So
perhaps this is the right plan.
Yeah, so let me also relate to you kind of how this evolved. And you bring up a very good point about the depth And in fact, during some of the earlier iterations of this plan, we saw actually more acreage devoted to the retail commercial at a greater depth. But as you recall, that included a big box store, which the governing body was not in favor of and wanted to go to a different, sort of more intimate retail complex than a big box store, for any number of reasons, including what the impact might be on the future residential behind it. So, I don't, this is, I think, a little bit different than the prototype retail that we've been seeing, and that's what's been approved across the street in Hanover. And again, this is how it evolved to the physical plan that we kind of tailored it at, tailored the redevelopment plan after. So I mean that's where we are.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I for one am very comfortable with the plan as it exists right now. I think it's a last minute thought. I mean, 10, 20 weeks ago, this might have been a thing we could have talked about, but I think we've come pretty far down the road right now, and I would be very, very comfortable in staying with the plan as it is, within
Because I feel having residential properties on Hanover Road, they're gonna sell or rent for a lot less than ones that are not facing Hanover Road. And probably the developer is gonna feel the same way.
And that was one of the issues that we discussed at the last meeting.
Right, we have to, I mean, heavying up the commercial toward MLK Avenue, I think there are some industrial buildings there, but it's also residential right across the street, so I think we have to be careful with all of that as well. Could you, one of the things I was going to ask you is whether you could draw or at least approximate on the map where that 300 to 600 foot boundary is that you're written into 3, 2, 4, 8.
So, at the narrowest point, it was at about 300. And then it got up to about, I think, 450, 500 at its largest point based on the concept. And we've also provided some, we'll get to about the landscape berm, may actually take up a little bit more width based on our specs that are shown here. So that's how we kind of went from 300 to, we were like 550, and we just upped it to 600 to provide some flexibility and to account for the berm, which we're saying should be on the commercial side.
Where's the 600, so but you're written in here if you go up as much as 600.
Correct, so 600 here would take us somewhere in, would sort of take out this first row of houses per se.
But then also, but if you extend it all the way to MLK, it would take out that whole area, right?
Yeah, it would. But the developer is obligated to provide the different housing types, and the developer has to put it somewhere. Again, it's permissive, Mr. Chairman, it's not mandatory.
Right. I just wanted to get an idea, that's where it is exactly, where contemplated commercial would be okay, and where residential would be okay.
And you're right, here is probably its narrowest at 300, and then we want to also provide the flexibility to provide a greater depth in the area where you have the larger commercial buildings, and you know you're going to have some loading in the rear. So you do want to provide adequate separation between the commercial and the residential. So it's just for purposes of flexibility. And they're also limited by the acreage limits ranges, so all these things come into play.
Right.
I was just wondering if you had that kind of depth anywhere, like what we're talking about now.
Yeah, it does. But
On
he just
Hanover
showed it.
Avenue?
Without
He
doubt.
just showed it. He just, that's what he was doing out there. 300 to 600 feet.
To Colgate. But you're talking about anywhere else on West?
We're talking about the portion of the property from Hanover back that can be used for retail commercial, 300 to 600. This plan shows somewhere between, and I'm kind of rounding, somewhere between like 300 and 500, or close to 500.
Just for the Colgate property.
Just for this?
Yeah.
So, Mr. Gover, we'll keep your comments in mind and we'll allow him to continue.
Sure.
The other thing on page 7, which I didn't mention, is that we do have a FAR limit of 20%, which is sort of the standard. And we also base that on our existing zoning. And we do have a limitation on a number of buildings that could be smaller than a certain size, because what we didn't want to see is just a bunch of individual pad sites along the entire frontage. We understand that that's part of the mix, but we wanted to make sure that it was basically some multi-store buildings with potential inline retail, inline restaurants, as well as some freestanding retail uses such as banks, pharmacies, and restaurants. And then we also, on page before, we did put the limit on the number of the drive-throughs, because we just didn't want it to be a sea of drive-throughs, but we wanted to provide some balance, understanding that they do to some extent drive the market.